You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. And welcome back, everybody. And if you are watching here on video, you can tell we have a special episode because usually we don't do video. And if you are watching, I apologize that I look like Moses coming down the mountainside here with my face shining. Just the way my computer is set up. I'm facing the window and it's bright. So that's all that is there. But we have a guest with us today, Braeden Størkersen. He is a progressive Christian pastor and also has a YouTube channel up and running now called Religionless Studios. I wish I could remember exactly how I first heard about it. I think it just showed up in my YouTube feed. So for once, the feed was actually right in recommending that to me. But I was watching the videos he was putting out for the first few months here, and the more I was watching, the more I thought, wow, this is really good. I want to talk to this guy and see if we can get him on. So, Braeden, we are glad to have you here with us today. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, let's get started off by having you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to start this Religionless Studios.
Yeah, so my name is Braeden Størkersen. Pronouns are he, him. And I grew up in the Reformed Church here in Southern California, kind of Calvary Chapel adjacent, if you're familiar with Calvary Chapel at all.
Sure.
And there was very much this focus on really that the Reformation of understanding the scriptures. There was this deep love for the scriptures that I was raised with and ingrained with. And so much so that I chose to be a pastor and a theologian, that I became just so in love and enamored with the scriptures that I wanted to study it for the rest of my life and to understand it to the best of my ability. And there was this there was this phrase that was thrown around in some circles within the Reformed Church: reformed and always reforming. Some people didn't really like that. There was kind of this idea of, even if it wasn't said explicitly, of, well, we kind of figured out everything with the Reformation.
Yep.
There was kind of this idea of Reformed theology, of we've got it dialed in. We have our
Mhm.
5 points of Calvinism. We have all of our different theologies and systematic theologies in place. But for some, there was more this idea of, no, that the Reformation was just the beginning. We are still
Mm.
reforming. And so there were some pockets of the Reformed Church that were more conservative. There were some that were more progressive, so much so that when I was a pastor in the Reformed Church for several years, there was essentially this church split going on where
Mm.
within the denomination there was this debate of, are we going to be LGBTQ plus affirming or not?
Mm.
And for me, I was in the midst of deconstruction at the time, very much so because of my own experiences that led me to that. When I
Mm.
was 16 and felt this pull toward ministry, my oldest brother essentially told our family, "Hey, I'm no longer Christian."
Mm.
Our close family friend came out of the closet as gay, basically within the same month of
Oh,
me saying,
wow.
"Hey, I feel this pull toward ministry."
Yeah.
Essentially, my whole worldview of, if you're not a Christian, you're going to hell, and if you're
Mm.
gay, you're living in sin, and maybe you're also going to hell as well.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
And I felt this pull, but at the same time, I was looking at these two people that I would still use the term, they are the most Christ-like people I know, and I was saying, this
Mm.
doesn't add up. I don't know if I can say my brother is going to hell, or that our close family friend is going to hell, or is living in sin. And so I began this process of really rethinking some of these core things that I'd been handed, of salvation, of, is it exclusive to just believers, or
Mm.
is there a possibility that everyone could be saved? And so over time I began to embrace Christian universalism, and I was asking
Mm.
these questions while I was in Bible college and seminary. So I actually had access to people that were brilliant, understood the scriptures, to be able to think through these things. And I began to realize and learn that there have been branches of Christianity the whole time that have
Mm.
embraced queer folks and that have embraced universalism, that
Mm.
since the very beginning there were Christian universalists.
Yeah.
And so over time I began to embrace more of this idea that that side of my faith that was reformed and always reforming. And so for me it didn't seem contradictory to being a Reformed Christian and a Reformed pastor, that of course I'm
Mm.
going to be evolving. But ultimately, the church that I was a part of sided with more of the conservative side of the denomination that said, no, we're not going to be LGBTQ plus affirming. And essentially, as that split happened, that was that recognition that I might not be in the right congregation, the right denomination for my particularly unfolding and evolving faith.
Mm.
And so over time, I found a different denomination that is really more at the heartbeat of where I'm at. And I'm now a pastor in that denomination. That's Disciples of Christ.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I just got ordained as a public theologian, so I now get to do this
Oh,
work
congrats.
of really unpacking the scriptures from more of a progressive and ever evolving worldview.
Mm.
So I'm really excited about that, and that's where Religionless Studios kind of came out of this deep love for the scriptures, but also this desire to be reformed and always reforming.
Mm. That's good. And I love that you had that already ingrained in you of the always reforming, because coming from an independent fundamental Baptist tradition myself, there was absolutely influence of Calvinism, but
Yeah.
we didn't want to accept that. We wanted to say Calvinism was evil and we're not reformed and all this stuff. And so I remember being in Bible college, and I don't know that anyone ever said it in these words, but just thinking to myself, there's nothing new I can do in ministry. My like literally every bit of theology has ever that could ever be said or discovered or collated, it's all been put together. So I'm like, what am I going to work for to tell people stuff that if they have enough books, they could find it on their own? So I kind of wish someone had ingrained that in me earlier on. That's been harder for me as I've gone through some deconstruction, because I had to get past the idea that it's okay to change because we didn't think it was. But like you said, there have always been different traditions that had different ways of thinking. So I just want to say to anyone listening here, Braeden has already touched on some major topics of deconstruction. And so if that makes you feel uncomfortable, or you're saying, I'm not sure how I feel about that right now, that's okay. Like we would tell you, this is a journey. This is not something that anyone ever just flips a switch and, oh man, I believe the exact opposite of what I've always believed. I think this is a really important conversation to have because Braeden is so openly Christian and yet also progressive Christian. So even if you're coming from a different side, listen, this is not someone trying to tear down the Bible. This is someone who has dedicated their life to understanding the Bible and sharing it. So I think that's going to be a really good conversation here. I did want to ask, since I think the reference might go over some listeners' heads here, or just by their heads, I suppose. Give us the quick rundown, the religionless name. Where did that come from?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So religionless Christianity was a term that was coined by Bonhoeffer. Dietrich
Mhm.
Bonhoeffer was a German theologian who lived during the time of World War II underneath the Nazi regime. And he was really disgusted by how so many of his fellow German Lutherans were just totally okay with the whole Nazi ideology and regime and everything. And many German theologians and pastors were in bed with the Nazi party essentially.
Mhm.
He was disgusted by that, and he was one of the few who really opposed Hitler and the Nazis. And and so when he was in prison underneath the Nazi regime, he coined this term and kind of wrote letters to one of his friends from seminary about these musings of this religionless Christianity. And the whole
Mhm.
idea was that religion will always be on the side of the powerful. Religion will always be
Mm.
on the side of those who are on top of the hierarchy, so to speak. And so he wanted to imagine Christianity in a way that it could not be co opted by nationalism like it had before.
Mhm.
And so when I was thinking through what to call this Bible commentary, and this Bible commentary is rooted in liberation theology, really this idea of God is on the side of the oppressed, not the powerful.
Mhm.
That term religionless Christianity really came to the top because we are in
Mhm.
another time of Christian fascism very much
Mhm.
becoming prominent within the United States and within the world at large. And I want to oppose Christian nationalism, and I want to interpret the Bible in a way that something like what happened under the Nazi regime could never happen within a
Mm.
faith interpretation, like what I'm hoping to bring about.
Good. Yeah. It's something I've been mulling about in the last few years and just recently realized Bonhoeffer did a lot of this before me, so I'm starting to look into some of his work there. But yeah, just this whole thought of like the way Jesus started. I mean, not that he was looking to start Christianity necessarily, but with what he started with, it was this grassroots movement. And within one generation, it gained enough power to be abusive. I mean, just look at the letters that we have in the Bible where Paul or whoever was writing each of those is addressing spiritual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. Like it took one generation and we were already meshing Christianity and power. So it's not easy to avoid that, but I appreciate that people are trying to.
Yes, exactly. Anytime an institution arises, there will be the powerful and the powerless that arise within those institutions. And so the Christian church is no different. And so we can do our best to combat that, but ultimately it will happen.
Yeah. So, coming from a more conservative background originally, and now calling yourself a progressive Christian and doing this channel and everything, how would you say that progressive Christianity might be different from other forms of Christianity that people are more familiar with? Because, like, if I say Christian, people might think, oh, Roman Catholic, or maybe even Baptist, or Billy Graham or Joel Osteen, but not too many people are thinking progressive Christian. So, how does that stand apart from other forms of Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's no singular denomination or set of beliefs for progressive Christians. Just like conservative Christians, there's a lot of diversity. I mean, you've mentioned that we're independent fundamentalist Baptist,
Mm-hmm.
and you saw Calvinism as like evil at the time, whereas
Right.
Calvinism would very much be a conservative Christian
Absolutely. Yeah.
theology. So even though I grew up within the conservative Christianity, even within conservative Christianity, there's different. But there's that idea to conserve of
Mm-hmm.
there is something, there is a systematic theology, there is a way of understanding God and the universe and church that we have to conserve and preserve.
Mm.
Whereas at the heart of progressive is there is progress to say that no, that there is no systematic theology that we can hold to where we will have absolutely figured everything out and we have now put God in a box and we understand God and the universe and church and how things should work. And
Mm.
so the heartbeat of progressive Christianity is that God is still speaking. In fact,
Mm.
the United Church of Christ, the sister denomination to the disciples, there's their logo is just a comma.
Mm.
And there's
Mm.
that idea that don't put a period where God has put a comma, that God is still
Mm.
speaking, the Holy Spirit is still moving. And so we need to be open and willing to listen to the Holy Spirit in that because we don't have God all figured out. And there will be
Mm.
ways in which we are living, in which we understand God that have missed the mark.
Yeah.
And so we try to kind of listen to that and be aware of that. And I would say that's kind of one of the big differences between the mindset that come from a conservative Christian, which is no, we've got it all, we got to conserve this, whereas progressive Christians tend to kind of go, no, there's still progress to be made. There, we can still look to our tradition and be rooted in tradition, but place a comma there and
Mm.
be willing to move forward and listen to the Holy Spirit in that.
Yeah, that's really good. And I wish more Christians would realize that the entire idea of Christianity is progressive because our movement did not start out as Christian. It was originally Jewish. So
Yes,
in a
exactly.
way, all of Christianity is progressive. It progressed from the original belief system and added to it and said, "Oh, God's still speaking," when there were others that said, "Oh no, I'm going to stay on the more conservative side." And now you have Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. And I would point to Paul the Apostle, Saul of Tarsus, where he was a Pharisee. As far as conservative beliefs go, he was the conservative of his day,
Right.
and so much so that he was opposing this new movement. And as he was on the road to Damascus, he had this experience where he encountered the risen Christ, And
Mm.
from there, he had to go, I have to rethink my whole
Hmm.
belief system. I have to rethink how I interpret the Hebrew scriptures. And arguably, much of his letters are him trying to
Mm.
reinterpret and re-understand and reimagine his whole tradition. And so, yeah, I agree. The whole Christian movement very much is a progressive movement because there is this idea of no, we didn't have everything figured out clearly. And the deep irony is to take Paul, who is reimagining and trying to re-understand and reinterpret the scriptures, and then say, no, now Paul had it all figured out.
Right, right.
and but Paul did not have it all figured out. He was very much figuring it out as he went and
Mm.
trying to think through what is this new way of thinking about God? How does that get lived out in these local congregations?
And it's also arbitrary too. Like so much of what we consider to be established doctrine is Reformation era. So why did it take 1500 years for Christians to get it right? But we wouldn't accept the slavery that Christians were okay with back then. So why were they wrong on that and we didn't get that right until 150 years ago? We just were drawing arbitrary lines on where doctrine got established instead of realizing it's always
Exactly.
moving.
On the topic of slavery, there's 30 something passages that don't just condone slavery, but give instructions on how to do it. So
Hmm.
naturally, the abolitionists had to reinterpret and re-understand the scriptures, this trajectory argument of freedom, in order to get to a point of abolition. And that was recent history in terms of the grand scheme of the Christian tradition. And so I would just say, okay, if we can do that with slavery, there's obviously a
Hmm.
more liberative way to read the scriptures, and that's what we want to do with other people groups to be
Hmm.
more liberating for all people and not just a select group of people.
Hmm. Well said. Now, when we're dealing with conservative Christianity, faith is often rooted in a very clear set of doctrinal boundaries, the kind of systematic theology you talked about. What would you say are some of the core values that would anchor you now as a progressive Christian? I think this is even some of what you got into in a couple of your first videos on YouTube.
Yeah, yeah, because the Bible commentary I'm creating, it's the tagline is it's a progressive, liberative Bible commentary. And so the first set of videos, I kind of just wanted to explain what do I mean by progressive, what do I mean by liberative. And I acknowledge there's no singular way of thinking about it because progressive Christianity isn't an established denomination with a core set of beliefs. But I'll just kind of read what I did in my first couple of videos. It's on progressivechristianity.org. They have these 5 core values that I think are very helpful as a starting place, and they are
Hmm.
just that, they're values. They're not doctrines and beliefs. So by calling
Hmm.
ourselves progressive Christians, we mean that we are Christians who, one, believe that following the way and teachings of Jesus can lead to experiencing sacredness, wholeness, and unity of all life, even as we recognize that the Spirit moves in beneficial ways in many faith traditions. Number 2, seek community that is inclusive of all people, honoring differences in theological perspective, age, race, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, class, or ability. 3, strive for peace and justice among all people, knowing that behaving with compassion and selfless love toward one another is the fullest expression of what we believe. Number 4, embrace the insights of contemporary science and strive to protect the earth and ensure its integrity and sustainability. And number 5, commit to a path of lifelong learning, believing there is more value in questioning than in absolutes. And so those would kind of be the core values. I imagine you might have some follow-up questions to that, but those would kind of be the core values that I identify as what what tends to unite a lot of progressive Christians.
Yeah, and yeah, just listening to that, I'd say like it basically boiled down to Jesus is important, but we can still learn from other people. Peace and justice should be for everyone. Science and the Bible aren't enemies, and we should keep learning. So if you
Yes,
can agree with those, you might even be a little more progressive than you think you are.
100%.
Yeah, that's really good. And so many times especially coming, at least on my end, coming from an independent Baptist tradition, we emphasized independent. Like we had other IFB churches in the area. We barely even acknowledged they existed. Like we didn't do group events or anything like that. But there's so much similarity between Christians that we don't always realize is there. Like our circles can be a lot broader than sometimes we allow it to be. And this is a really beautiful way to say, I guess with humility, like I don't know everything. My tradition doesn't get everything 100% right, and neither does yours. So we can learn from each other.
Yeah, there has to be a spirit of humility in order to continue to grow.
Yeah. I do want to talk about the Bible here for a minute because I know that progressive Christians often get stereotyped as being like dismissive of the Bible. Yet,
Yeah.
as you've already mentioned here, you're working on a progressive Christian video Bible commentary, which I'll just say that was part of what made me think we need to have this conversation because that felt like something I would do. Yeah, let's just make a whole commentary on the Bible. I can do this. Like I
Yeah.
love this the scope of that. It's awesome. And you've got a few up on Genesis already. At least as of the time of this recording, I'm sure it'll be more by the time we get it out. And I'll let you know too, we're linking to your Genesis episodes on our show episodes that we've done on Genesis. So if anyone's interested in those, we have them on our episode pages as well for Genesis there. But what role would you say that the Bible plays in your life and beliefs as a progressive Christian?
Yeah, so I mean, as a Christian, I want to be rooted in the way and the teachings of Jesus. And Jesus was radically influenced by the Hebrew scriptures. And
Hmm.
so I want to be also influenced by that story, and I want that story to radically influence my story. And so I would say we take the Bible seriously, but we don't always take it literally, which
Mm,
is where it can sometimes differ from more conservative branches of Christianity that I don't necessarily consider some of the stories in Genesis to have literally happened. I don't
mm,
personally believe in a literal Adam and Eve, but I believe that there is a message, a theological idea that is being told through that story that I want to capture, I want to get to the heartbeat of, and then I want to apply that to my life. And
mm,
so I would still say that I'm trying to be influenced and immersed in the Bible,
mm.
but I don't always view it as literal history or science. And so that would be the difference, but ultimately I'm still immersed and influenced by not just the New Testament, but all of the scriptures.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I just remember hearing so often growing up, like if you don't think these stories are literal, you might as well throw the whole thing away. It doesn't matter for anything. But you're saying you're still finding so much meaning in it. And as I've deconstructed and worked through my own journey, um, I mean, here I am. I have a Bible podcast for crying out loud.
Mhm.
Like it still
Absolutely.
matters. And the more I study it, even though my views have shifted, I feel like it's actually more respectful to let the Bible be what it's trying to be instead of what my church bias tells me it needs to be.
Yeah, and that mindset of if you can't believe this one iota here, then you have to throw out the whole thing. That's just so damaging to a person's faith. Like, and I try to say in my Bible commentary when I deconstruct certain ideas, like
Mm,
in one of my videos, I did talk about how I don't think that Genesis is literal history, but then I immediately go and say, but you can still be a Christian and have a vibrant faith, even if you don't believe Genesis was literal history. Because some
yeah.
people, they'll immediately go, well, then obviously I have to throw it out. And
Mm.
there will be some people who naturally will say, I'm not a real Christian because of those certain things. But ultimately, I still believe in and follow the way and the teachings of Jesus. And and that's what I would point to of a literal Adam and Eve has nothing to do with the resurrection. If
Mhm.
you can still follow and believe Jesus if you respect the history and science there.
Yeah. And again, to our listeners here, it's okay if you do take those literally. It's
Yes.
not okay if you take that and say someone who believes different is not a Christian, because
Mm.
you will find messages of salvation throughout the Bible, messages of deliverance. You'll have stuff about, oh, we believe in Jesus, that he died, rose again, was buried, yeah, all this. What you'll never find in one of those lists is, thou shalt believe the Bible is 100% literal in every passage.
Yes, exactly.
So if you're adding that to a requirement list for salvation, you're adding to the Bible because it never says that's something you need to do.
Yeah.
And Yeah, so I really appreciate how you've still found meaning and you're working to share that with others there because there's so many ways you can read these stories and it's not as cut and dry. Because if it's just one way, once you've heard it, you've got nothing left to learn from it.
Yep,
But
exactly.
being able to hear from these different voices, it really brings the text to life because you can hear perspectives you never realized were there.
Yeah, and I would also just add that what the Bible is in terms of the amount of books has been different over the years.
Oh yeah, we
So-
just recently
so-
finished a series on that.
oh, cool. Yeah, so
Mhm.
so within the Orthodox tradition, there's 81 books. Within the Catholic tradition, there's 73 books. Within the Protestant tradition, there's 66 books.
Right.
And so we need to acknowledge that the Bible has evolved in terms of what books are there. And
Mhm.
and so part of Religionless is at some point, I'm not just going to do the 66 Protestant books, but I want to do
Mm.
all 81 books that
Oh, great.
in the larger Christian traditions out there because it's sacred to other Christians. And so I want to be sensitive and aware of that and say, hey, how can we learn from these different books as well?
That's super cool. There's not enough resources out there right now on the apocryphal works and stuff that's not in the Protestant canon. At least
Yeah,
not stuff that's accessible to a lot of people. I mean, if you're coming from a Catholic tradition, you have it included, or an Orthodox, but I'd love to see that get more mainstream, where more people have access to that. So love that. Another thing that I definitely heard growing up with progressive Christianity is that it's basically moral relativism. Like you no longer have a black and white standard for right and wrong. So how would you say you've maintained a consistent moral framework while both embracing inclusivity and diversity?
yeah, I would just say I'm rooted in the way and the teachings of Jesus. Sometimes progressive Christians refer to themselves as red letter Christians because of how certain Bibles have the words of Jesus in red. And I would just acknowledge that, okay, we're trying to root ourselves first and foremost in the teachings of Jesus, in the words of Jesus, and then to interpret the rest of the Bible through what Jesus says,
Mm.
which is very Christian, you know. So I would just
Right.
emphasize once and once more that progressive Christians are in fact Christians that are rooted in the way and the
Mm,
teachings of Jesus. And there are times in which we have formed dogmas and doctrines around something that Jesus did not say, perhaps around something
mm,
that Paul said. And and so what we try to do is acknowledge, for example, with LGBTQ plus inclusion, Jesus never said anything about same-sex
mm.
relationships. Paul said a couple things about same-sex relationships, perhaps, but ultimately Jesus did not. And so trying to recognize that it's not moral relativism. We're rooted in the way
Mm.
and the teachings of Jesus. And Jesus said a lot about morality. The entire
Mhm.
Sermon on the Mount are Jesus' moral teachings.
Yeah.
And so we want to then root ourselves in that and then say, what does this look like in the modern world?
Mm.
And there will be times in which maybe we push against something that Paul said, but we're ultimately leaning more into what Jesus said in doing that.
Yeah, it's so funny. I had a little bit of a brain explosion as you were saying that here. Like this
Yeah.
clicked in a way it never had before. This was certainly true in Baptist circles, and I know without asking, this was true if you came from a Reformed circle. We said we focused on Jesus and everything was about Jesus, but more often than not, we focused on Paul. A lot of preaching was Romans, Galatians, First Corinthians, First Timothy, Ephesians. And I wonder if part of that is because we have this idea of focus on the new stuff because a lot of Christians focus on the New Testament over the old. Oh, we want to go with the new. Well, Paul is placed in most Bibles after the Gospels. So I almost wonder if it's just subconsciously forced so many Christians to place Paul's doctrine over Jesus because we have this idea that the further in the Bible it is, the better it is.
Yeah, and I would say in an American context in particular, we the way we think is influenced by Western civilization. And so Paul's writings were written for Western civilization, so to speak, in terms of he was writing to a Greco-Roman audience in many cases. And
True.
so his teachings are just much more accessible and comprehensible to us than a lot of Jesus'
Mm.
teachings, which are more Jewish and
Yeah. Oh,
Eastern in
I never
nature.
thought of that. You're right. Yeah.
So so we tend to just naturally grasp it grasp Paul's teachings more because it's more familiar to us,
Mm,
prose literature versus storytelling, parables, uh,
right, right.
asking questions like Jesus often does. A lot of those things are a little more foreign to us, so we naturally gravitate toward the familiar, which is Paul. And ultimately, we're not followers of Paul.
Right.
Paul acknowledges that as well. We're
Yeah,
followers of
yeah, yeah, true.
Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, that we just think of Italy and Greece as being Eastern because it's East to us, but yeah, by comparison, that was a much more Western culture than Jesus was in. So, yeah, oh, that gave me some stuff to think about too. I love that. Yeah. I definitely remember thinking when I was younger that progressive Christians focus too much on politics and like social gospel sort of thing.
Yeah.
Now, ironically, it's kind of switched to the point that conservative Christians are also very engaged in politics right now.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Right, that's what the tables have almost turned there. But what place would you say that politics should hold in the Christian faith?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you acknowledged first and foremost that all Christians have really gotten political, and
Mm,
that's just our human nature of we will get involved in the politics surrounding us. But I would acknowledge that the gospel to some extent is political. When Jesus was teaching and preaching, he stepped into a culture that used a lot of the terms that he used. We kind of are removed from that nowadays, but when the Roman Empire was at large, they would go and take over a new area, and a messenger would come in and say, and proclaim the gospel of Caesar, that
yep.
Caesar is Lord. And if you acknowledge this, if you respond to this accordingly, then you will experience all the beauty and the flourishing of the Roman Empire. And the
Mm,
subtle undertone was that if you don't believe this and if you don't respond accordingly to this, then the Roman Empire will squash you and your people. And on the Roman currency, it said that Caesar is Lord.
mm,
So when Jesus comes onto the scene and proclaims the gospel of the kingdom of heaven, and people are saying Jesus is Lord, this would have been radically political. This would have really unsettled a lot of people within the Roman Empire. And so naturally, yes, Jesus was pushed against by a lot of the religious leaders, and they were the ones who ultimately wanted him to be crucified. But crucifixion was a Roman punishment for criminals who opposed the Roman Empire.
yeah.
And so the gospel was very political at the time.
Hmm.
And, and so I would just acknowledge that and say that, yeah, there will be elements in which the teachings of Jesus sometimes push against and are countercultural to the teachings of whatever empire, whatever culture that you are under. And the
Hmm.
United States, for lack of a better term, is the empire of our day. At least one of them. It is a military superpower. It has a deep culture that has influenced and colonized the world at different points. And so there will be times where it will push against the politics of our day.
Yeah.
Many of the prophets spoke about caring for refugees, for example.
Hmm.
And that eventually becomes, in our context, it becomes a political issue.
Right.
And I'm putting air quotes right now because there are things that at different points in history don't really matter to American civilization, but then it becomes politicized,
Hmm.
and then at that point, then we consider, oh, we've now gone from religion to politics. But no,
Hmm.
when you talk about loving your neighbor, there will be times where certain policies oppress your neighbor, if they mistreat your neighbor. And so sometimes, in order to love your neighbor, you have to oppose the policies and procedures that oppress them, that mistreat them, that naturally, in the extreme sense of World War II Germany with
Mm,
Bonhoeffer, in order to love your neighbor, you had to oppose Hitler, you had to oppose the
mm,
Nazis. That was something that you had to do, and you wouldn't have looked at Bonhoeffer and say, "Oh man, you're no longer being a Christian, you're getting into politics."
right, right.
So in the same way, there will be times in which American policies
Mm,
sometimes mistreat people within our civilization, within our world, and we will then have to look at these policies and go, no, I think we have to oppose them in order to love our neighbor best. So,
Mm,
in a key example of that I already mentioned was refugee care, of caring for the foreigner, of
mm,
there is this constant call within the scriptures to care for the foreigner amongst us. And yet now in politics we have this mindset of, well, who's legal and who's illegal, and so
right.
now we have to mistreat those who are illegal. But the scriptures do not draw any such category. In fact,
Mm,
the whole parable of the Good Samaritan is this idea that a spiritually mature person does not ask who is my neighbor.
mm,
We simply love and include everybody.
mm.
And so that's ultimately my response to the idea of, oh, well, progressive Christians get too involved in politics. No, we just simply want to love our neighbor, and sometimes that demands getting involved in politics, so to speak.
Yeah, and I wonder if part of that stereotype just arises from the church and state division in the US, because through most of human history, there was no difference between politics and religion, or religion and any other part of your life. Religion was just ingrained in your life. And now that we separated it, it's like, oh, dealing with immigration or, any of these other issues, that's all politics. The church is just about preaching spiritual salvation. It's like, well, that kind of gets away from the idea that salvation is just a word for deliverance. Like you have better training in liberation theology than I do, but by the time this episode comes out, we'll be in the middle of an Exodus series. And
Oh,
that is
cool.
all about deliverance, from empire. And if we read that as just spiritualizing it, we miss the point.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Mentioning Exodus here, I'm just curious. Like, I know Exodus will be a little ways down the road for you, but is there anything that stands out in your mind that you think from like the start of Exodus up until like the plagues or when they get to Sinai, anything that you might toss in as a little nugget that might end up in your commentary when you get there?
Oh gosh, I mean, I would just point to the there's so many things, but I'll name a few. At the very beginning, when Pharaoh looks in fear at the Hebrew people and says, "Hey, there's so many of them, so
Mm,
we have to oppress them, we have to mistreat them." And I would just name how our fear sometimes can lead us to become monstrous in our behavior and
mm,
oppress people and mistreat people. And it's to acknowledge that it's rooted in fear, that
good.
so much oppression in the world is rooted in that. And then I would acknowledge that a good amount of teaching underneath some of the plagues, for example, is that those in power are just human. And I get
Mm.
there because many of the plagues were kind of pointing to a lot of the Egyptian gods of the
Ah,
time.
yeah. Yeah.
So so there was a god that controlled the river. There was a god that controlled the locust. There was a god that controlled the agriculture. There was a god that controlled the sun. In fact,
Yeah.
that god who controlled the sun was Ra. And the gods were not just in Egyptian lore, were not just something that was out there in some other dimension, but the gods were the rulers.
Hmm.
That Pharaoh himself was seen to be Ra. So when all these plagues are happening within the story, the idea would have been that the Egyptian people would have been looking at their governors, their Pharaoh, and
Mm.
saying, "Why aren't you doing something about this?" And ultimately, underneath all of that is, well, they're not gods. The
Yep.
people who are rulers are just human like us.
Mm.
And whenever I preach that in an American context, I talk about how when I was raised, I was taught that, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, they never lied. There was this
Right, right.
there was this sense in which we spoke about some of our founding fathers as if they were absolutely perfect, and the
Oh yeah.
Constitution then is like their scripture that we then
Yeah.
get handed from these perfect leaders. And so
Do
to
you ever
acknowledge,
see that painting in the Capitol of
oh yeah,
Washington almost deified? Like,
yes,
yeah,
exactly.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and so our founding fathers are often spoken about as these perfect, flawless leaders. And
Yep.
fast forward to today, we still feel this need to
Mm.
defend our person at all costs, whoever that person is. If you're a Trump supporter, then Trump makes no mistakes. Trump is absolutely
Yep.
perfect. He's almost spoken of as like the second coming of Christ, or at least second to Christ. And then
Hmm.
the same can go for more progressive people. Of
Yeah.
there's this felt need to defend this person at all costs, whether it be
Mm.
Biden, Kamala, or Obama. There's this
Yeah.
felt need to defend them, but to acknowledge that they're human. And then at that point, we can disagree with their policies and disagree with what's going on,
Mm.
and have a more civil conversation about all of these things is very important. And
Mm.
that for me kind of comes from these teachings within scriptures that show that our human leaders are just that. They're human. They're not gods. They're
Mm.
not deified beings that we have to see as inerrant.
Yeah. Good preaching. We'll definitely
Yeah,
be looking forward to when you get up to that point in the
yeah,
series there.
yeah. It's gonna
Uh,
be a while, but I'm looking forward to it too.
yeah. So talking a little bit about salvation here, personal salvation is definitely the focus in a lot of evangelical circles. So how would you say progressive Christianity tends to interpret salvation? Like what role does that play in your faith practice?
Well, I'll kind of circle back to Exodus with answering that question because
Mm.
in seminary we were taught this idea. It's called the principle of first mention.
Mm.
And it's this idea when you're studying a word and an idea, a doctrine within scripture, look to the time where it's first mentioned. And that
Mm.
kind of sets the precedent for how the rest should be interpreted. And do you know when the first time salvation is mentioned in scripture?
I believe it's in Exodus, but I don't remember where
Yep.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so in
Yeah.
Exodus, right after they have crossed the Red Sea, there is this song that is sung
Ah,
to
chapter
God in worship.
15, yeah, the Song of
Yeah.
Deliverance. Yeah.
And they say the Lord has become my salvation. And so I
Mm.
would just ask the question, what did God save them from in that instance? It wasn't from divine wrath. It wasn't from going
Mm.
to hell after you die. It was from very real oppression in the here and the now.
Mm.
And and so I would just say we have over spiritualized salvation, where salvation is about being saved from God's wrath so that we can go to heaven after we die. But the gospel is more about the here and the now. When Jesus went moving and throughout the world and teaching, he didn't sit down and tell people, hey, you're all hellbound, and if you believe in me, if you believe that I died on the cross for your sins, then you will go to heaven
Mm.
after you die. That's not the gospel that Jesus preached. Jesus very
Mm.
much preached the gospel of the kingdom of heaven. He said the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and he taught his disciples to pray that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Mm.
And so the narrative is not about heaven and hell, it's about
Mm.
heaven and earth coming together, and ultimately how Christians are invited to participate in that. And so the gospel is that the world is being redeemed. The gospel is that heaven and earth are coming together. And so salvation in that narrative is all the different ways in which heaven and earth come together, all the different ways in which oppressed people are liberated, all the different ways in which we experience more redemption in the here and the now. And so that's what I would point to when it comes to salvation, because that is more consistent with the Hebrew scriptures idea of salvation, as well as it's more consistent with what Jesus talked about when he talked about salvation and liberation. In fact, salvation and liberation in Exodus are essentially synonymous.
Mhm. That's a big mental hurdle for a lot of people to get over, but the more you
Oh
look
yeah.
into it, the more you start to realize, wow, this doesn't quite fit with what I was taught, but like, yeah, that's kind of what's right there in the Bible. So,
Yeah. And I would just say on another note, on that same wavelength of just what it results in your own life, of if you believe
mm.
salvation is just about going to heaven after you die, then you're not as inclined to really be involved in making the world a better place and loving your neighbor. You're more just
Yeah.
kind of waiting to be beamed up in the rapture or die and go to heaven. Whereas if you believe that salvation is about heaven and earth coming together, then you're much more inclined to do a lot of the things that Jesus told us to do.
I mean, I heard someone say it was a pastor when I was a kid that I'm just going to leave all the lights on in my house, leave my car running where it doesn't matter what energy I use, what
Yeah,
gas
yeah,
I use, it's all going to burn anyway. I mean,
yeah.
that's not quite what God wants you to do with his earth, but all right.
Yep, but
So
it's
yeah.
it's the inevitable mindset of some of the interpretations of the gospel today.
Yeah. I had definitely heard people say that progressive Christianity is just like one short stop on the road before you get to atheism. Like, yeah, if you're coming from a conservative Christian background and you're thinking progressive Christian, you might as well just jump the ship entirely. How might you respond to someone who's viewing the faith change that way and seeing progressive Christianity as just a step before you get to an atheist?
I would say that anytime there's a different religious expression than your own, it's going to be viewed that way. In
Hmm.
fact, early Christians were criticized by the Roman Empire of being atheists because they rejected a lot of the gods of the Roman Empire. And
True.
so it's no different today. If you have a different understanding of God, then it's like, oh well, you're just one short step of atheism. I will acknowledge that some people, as they're deconstructing, end up at atheism.
Hmm.
But I don't think that's because of progressive Christianity. I think it's
Hmm.
because many progressive Christians have removed fear from the equation. Many progressive Christians
Hmm.
are Christian universalists. They believe that everyone is going to be saved eventually. And so when you remove fear from the equation, yeah, there will be a chance that you choose to no longer follow God or choose to no longer believe in God. But to say that that's a core result of just being a progressive Christian, I would say that's nonsense because many progressive Christians remain Christian for the rest of their life. The United Methodist Church, the United Church of Christ, the Disciples of Christ. You look at all
Hmm.
these progressive denominations, and there are plenty of people who have been progressive their entire lives. They've been raised in this, and they've continued to follow Jesus and continued to be a progressive Christian all throughout their entire life. There are many elderly folks in progressive churches. This isn't some new thing. This has been something that's
Right.
been on for a long time. And there are plenty of people who choose to follow God their entire lives. If anything, I would criticize, as we talked about earlier, that mindset of if you throw out this one thing, you have to throw out the
Hmm.
entire thing. That I think is why some progressive Christians end up no longer being Christian because
True.
they've been taught and ingrained with, well, if you're deconstructing, you're not a real Christian. And so at a certain point, they kind of go, okay, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe I'm not a real Christian. And then they walk. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that. But I would definitely say I think it's a false criticism.
And you bring up a fantastic point I want to draw attention to here is you said a lot of times that's rooted in fear. If I can just say, like, if your belief in God is rooted in fear, fear of God, fear of judgment, fear of hell, that's not a relationship worth having anyway. Like
No.
that might not be such a bad thing to walk away from because no relationship built on fear is one worth having. And if removing fear removes a relationship, that's honestly better than one that is built in fear.
Yeah, if you apply that logic to a human relationship,
Hmm.
if if the only reason you're staying in that relationship is because of fear, that's an abusive relationship. And so many of us have sort of an abusive relationship with God where
Yeah.
we believe that God is going to punish us if we don't behave. We believe that God is going to send us to hell if we don't believe. And so we stay simply out of that fear. That's an abusive, toxic theology.
Yep.
And that's something that we have to move away from. And so many people ask me, well, if I remove the idea of hell, why be a Christian? And that's what I just no, that's a toxic theology. That's
Mm.
abusive. That's an abusive relationship. If that were a human relationship, and you're like, well, why would I stay if they're a loving person?
Yep.
Well, wouldn't that make you want to stay more, if anything?
Yep.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I find that idea so toxic and abusive for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I've brought up a handful of things here, but are there any other misconceptions about progressive Christianity or your own beliefs that you think would be worth clearing up to our listeners?
Not much beyond just emphasizing progressive Christians are real Christians.
Yeah.
I think sometimes there's this mindset from those who are in still more conservative circles of looking at a progressive Christian and going, well, you're not a real Christian anymore because you've abandoned X, Y, and Z doctrine. And so just emphasizing that, hey, we are real Christians. We believe in Jesus, the way, the teachings, the life, the teachings, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. many progressive Christians even will fully affirm the Apostles' Creed.
Yeah.
And yet there's just this slight tweak of, well, maybe it's hell's not eternal, or
Mm.
maybe we should affirm LGBTQ plus folks, and suddenly it's like, well, you're not a real Christian. It's like, wait, the Apostles' Creed says nothing about those things.
Yeah,
So
true.
so to acknowledge that progressive Christians are real Christians would be the main thing that I would point to.
Yeah. Speaking of that difference between progressive and conservative Christians, then, how do you think progressives and conservatives in Christianity could dialogue with each other in a healthier manner?
Oh, I mean, kind of along that same wavelength of just affirming that the other
Assume the other
person,
one's not evil?
yeah, assume that the other person is an actual genuine Christian,
Yeah.
because sometimes, I mean, I honestly watched a debate yesterday between a
Mm.
progressive Christian and a conservative Christian, and the conservative Christian kept saying, you claim to be a Christian,
Yeah.
so
Yep.
X, Y, and Z, and so I'm like, oh, like how can you dialogue about your faith together
Mm.
if you're assuming the other person is like this wolf in sheep's clothing who has some nefarious agenda,
Yep.
and to just assume the other person is a genuine Christian, to assume the other person is trying their best to follow Jesus, and to then just dialogue together around the way and the teachings of Jesus together. Because even though there are many conservative Christians, up to even a really far right Christian nationalist, I would still assume that they're a Christian.
Mm.
And so to give that same charitable mindset to the other side, whatever that other side is, to assume that they're a Christian if they say they're a Christian, to not question that, and ultimately that is a place of dialogue where then you can actually, in good faith, engage with the scriptures and the teachings of Jesus together.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need more of that. I coming from fundamentalism, it was always we're right, you're wrong. And it's hard to get that out of the mindset. Now that I find myself on a different version of Christianity, it's really easy to say, "Oh, how can those people call themselves Christians?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, because I did 3 years ago when I thought that too." So like, we have to be
Yeah.
careful not to just because you've changed beliefs doesn't mean that you're free of ever being a fundamentalist again. Like it's really easy to fall into that, and you have to, like Brandon said, trust that the other person's being honest and to see what you can learn instead of trying to correct what you think their belief system is.
Yeah, exactly. And progressive Christians, I will say, can be guilty of falling into a new fundamentalism as well,
Hmm.
where suddenly they've created a new systematic theology, and anyone who disagrees with that systematic theology isn't a real Christian or is evil somehow. And so, yeah, progressive Christians can very much benefit from embracing the idea that, hey, if someone says they're a Christian, believe them and dialogue together.
Yeah. So, where would you say you see Christianity heading in the next 10 to 20 years? And how does Religionless Studios hope to contribute to this always reforming Christianity?
Oh, wow. I mean, I would say we're already seeing it, that more and more people are embracing LGBTQ plus inclusion.
Hmm.
More people are kind of rejecting this idea of a fear-based God,
Hmm.
and so we're seeing more people go from evangelical to ex-evangelical or post-evangelical. And so I hope to contribute that to that in the small way of just having content out there that helps people understand the scriptures as they're going through all of this. Because as people are deconstructing, there so often is the question of, well, what about this verse? What about that verse?
Hmm.
How do I understand that in a different light? And so my hope is that over time there will be this vast library where if you Google what does Genesis 2:17 mean? What does
Hmm.
Exodus 15:8 mean? What does you name the verse? What does this
Right.
verse mean? That my hope is that you'll be able to have this content from Religionless that comments on it in a more progressive
Hmm.
way, in a way that's rooted in liberation theology, that will be much more accessible and understandable to people as they're deconstructing and as they're re-understanding and reimagining their faith.
I think you're well on your way to that. I've really enjoyed the videos you put out so far, And we'll make sure to link to the YouTube channel for sure in the episode notes. But thing that you're working on now that you'd like to share with the audience, anywhere they can find you on socials or any other projects you've got going on?
Yeah, just at Religionless on pretty much most social media platforms are where we're at. So, but yeah, we're working on this progressive video Bible commentary. It will be, I mean, you mentioned 10 to 20 years for the future Christian. It will probably be a good 20 years that I'll be working on this
Yeah.
Bible commentary because there are a lot of books to comment on. And as I said, I'm not just going to be doing the 66 Protestant books. I'm going to be doing all 81 of the books that include the Catholic canon and the Orthodox canon.
Yeah.
So that way, wherever someone's at in their tradition, they can have a more progressive way of understanding the scriptures.
Mm, Great. Well, Braeden, it has been a pleasure talking to you here today. I've really enjoyed this, and I appreciate how clearly and respectfully you share, your thoughts on this and your own journey and what you're trying to do. And I wish you all the best with Religionless, and I'll definitely keep watching the content as it comes out. So, any final thoughts, anything you want to add for our audience before we have to close out for today?
No, nothing more that I could think to add. Thank you so much for having me on, Colin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stay curious and keep asking questions about the uncut and unfiltered Bible.
There we have it. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.